In this video, we're going to be going over the different infantile reflexes. Anytime you see an asterisk next to a reflex, that's an indicator you need to know how to visually recognize the reflex. So if I gave you a video or a picture or a diagram on your exam, you would need to be able to recognize it. How we have all of these reflexes set up is I have like a summary slide. So we have our timeline from prenatal stages all the way up to 12 months. There's a table that's representing the reflex name, the stimulus, and the response. And then in following slides for any of these that have asterisks, I'll usually give you a picture or a video example of what that reflex actually looks like. So we'll start off with our primitive reflexes. These are present in prenatal stages and then just shortly after birth. The doll eye reflex is actually very quickly disappears after birth. And I have a speculation that it's because of our ability to see outside of amniotic fluid. So the doll eye reflex is the stimulus is if the head is flexed, right? So neck flexes, the eyes look up. Now, what I'm speculating is that this is kind of related to our vestibular ocular reflex, or vestibulo-ocular reflex, which is a tie between our vestibular system, which controls or is able to detect movements of the head and our orientation of our head in relation to our body. It's a tie between that vestibular system and information coming in through our visual system. So usually what happens is when our head tilts, right, regardless of where our head is tilting, we're still able to use this vestibulo-ocular reflex to keep our vision stable, which is very similar to like head flex, eyes look up, or there's movement of the eyes in an upward direction. So once we actually are able to process visual stimuli after birth, this doll eye reflex isn't really needed anymore because we can then incorporate our vestibulo-ocular reflex. You don't actually need to know what the vestibulo-ocular reflex is in this class, but just kind of like a thought that I had that I think is kind of interesting to push the point forward that reflexes disappear for other ones to appear. Another reflex that we see, or primitive reflex that we see in these prenatal up to 3 months after birth, is the Moro reflex. So this one, the stimulus is if the head is shaken or the position of the head is moved very suddenly. We notice there's an extension of the arms and legs, followed by a little period of flexion of the arms and legs. The asymmetrical tonic neck reflex has a stimulus when the head is turned to one side. And then the same side arm and leg will extend. So if my head turns to the right, my right arm and my right leg would extend. The Palmar grasping reflex has a similar timeline to the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. And with that one, if you touch the palm with your finger or an object, it will close around that object, right? So obviously this one, you can kind of think of it leads into grasping movements, okay? But babies don't have this intentional, or they're not born with the intention of grasping objects, so the reflex kind of functions for that until they're able to intentionally control hand movements. We'll go through the Moro reflex, or just give a visual representation. Usually the starting position is in a supine position, as you see in the video, and the baby is often elevated from a surface. So the stimulus is to shake or quickly change the position of the head. The response that we see is the arms, you can't see the legs, but arms and legs extend, and then that's followed by flexion of those appendages back into the body. For the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, The stimulus is that the head turns to one side. Again, usually this one's also observed in a supine position. But when the head turns to one side, the same side arm and leg extend. So hopefully I can get this to play. They weren't playing in presenter mode, so that's why things look a little different in this video. There it goes. Okay, so head turns to one side, arm and leg extend outwards. This reflex is actually functional for not allowing the baby to roll. Okay, so when the head turns, you'll later see in some of our other writing type reflexes or postural reflexes that this asymmetrical tonic neck reflex actually ends up disappearing in order for babies to develop the skill of rolling over. So it's kind of acting as a preventative measure. The other reflex I wanted you guys to be able to recognize is the Palmar grasping reflex. Now the starting position of this for this reflex to appear isn't really specified, but what happens is the palm is touched with some type of object. I'm going to turn that volume down because that's annoying. All right, but you can see palm is touched and then the hands or fingers close tightly around whatever the object is. So a lot of these primitive reflexes you think of they're like innate because you're born with them, but they're mainly for survival type things. Additional primitive reflexes that are present at birth that persist later, again, think survival. These ones, the searching, rooting, and sucking reflexes are related to feeding. Okay, so the sucking reflex, we'll start with that one, is where if you touch the lips above or below, right, a sucking motion with the mouth will occur. That's primarily important for breastfeeding and is particularly present in the first 3 months. The Babinski reflex is present up to 4 months, and that is when you stroke the sole of the foot, specifically from heel to toe. And when you do that, the toes extend. Searching or rooting reflexes are when you touch the cheek with a smooth object, or you just stimulate or touch the cheek, and then the head will turn to wherever, whatever side was stimulated. The plantar grasping reflex is kind of similar to the palmar grasping reflex. So if you stroke the ball of the foot or touch the ball of the foot, the toes tightly close around whatever stimulated the reflex. There we go. Okay. So let's look at the Babinski reflex. Again, stimulus is going to be stroking the foot from the heel to the toes. And then you can see once that stimulus is applied, the toes extend backwards. Okay. An example of our searching and rooting reflex, again, primary purpose of this one is for feeding. But the stimulus would be to touch the cheek, which we'll see here, and then we see the head turning, right? So searching, rooting, and sucking are usually kind of moved all together because as you can see, as the baby's head turns, there's stimulation to the lips, right? And then a sucking motion results. So searching, rooting, sucking reflexes are all related to feeding. Primitive reflexes that are present after birth up to 12 months, but these are kind of more scattered, so that's why I organized them in this respect. We have the palmar mandibular reflex, which is present from 1 to 3 months. This is where if you put pressure to both palms, you'll notice that the mouth opens, eyes close, and head flexes. So again, largely related to feeding or survival. The symmetrical tonic neck reflex appears between 6 and 7 months. And this one, well, I think it's better understood with a figure, but when the head and neck extend backwards, the arms extend and the legs flex. When the head and neck flex forward, the arms flex and the legs extend. So generally the same idea, but they're just opposite of each other based on the position of the head. We also have the startle reflex, which if you tap the abdomen or you startle the infant, their arms and legs will flex in towards their body. And that one's present between 7 to 12 months. Just to get a better idea of what the symmetrical tonic neck reflex looks like, the starting position is usually sitting or in a prone position, kind of like this. The stimulus, let's look at this one first. If we extend the head and neck, our upper extremity or arms will extend and lower extremity will flex. If we flex the head downwards, the arms flex in towards the body and the legs extend. Startle reflex, again, if you scare the infant, I love this gif, what happens is the arms and legs will flex into the body. Usually the starting position for this one, when it's tested in a clinical setting, is in a supine position. The startle reflex does extend into adulthood, but the specific difference is that infants are in a supine position. It's also noted that the startle reflex is kind of like an extension of the Moro reflex. So Moro reflex we saw from like prenatal periods up to about 3 or 4 months. And then after that disappears, we end up getting the startle reflex where we're flexing into the body instead of extending away. So those are our primitive reflexes. We also have postural reflexes, which are going to contribute to keeping an infant in an upright position. So these typically start to appear a little bit later in infancy when babies have they're developing more muscular strength and they can actually support their body weight in various positions. But the starting position for these ones is particularly important when testing reflexes. The Labyrinthine riding reflex, the starting position is in a supported upright position. So it could be sitting, you could be holding the baby in like a supported standing position as well. And this is able to be observed between 2 and 12 months. But if you tilt the infant, you'll notice that their head moves to stay upright. So if I tilt to the right, the head would tilt to the left, vice versa. If I go forward, head tilts backwards. If I lean them backwards, their head will tilt forwards. The pull-up reflex usually is done when they're sitting upright or if they're in a supine position. So what you would do is you would tip the infant forward or backwards, kind of depending on where they're starting. And what you'll notice is that their arms flex. Okay, so usually they'll grab onto your fingers and then they will pull themselves towards you. The derotative riding reflex, the starting position is supine. And for this one, we've got a couple different stimuli. So if you turn the legs and pelvis to one side, the trunk and head will follow the body. If you turn the head sideways, the body follows the head. So you can kind of see that the derotative riding reflex would be helpful in preparation for rolling over. Now, cool thing I wanted to point out, if I scroll back through my slides here, I had noted before the asymmetrical tonic reflex, which is present up until 4 months, the head turns to one side and then the same side arm and leg extend. That prevents the infant from rolling over. So once that disappears around 4 months, this derotative riding reflex will appear. So that that reflex has to disappear in order for them to be able to start to roll over. So this is an example of what the labyrinthine riding reflex would look like. Again, they're in a supported upright position, and then when you tilt them off vertical, the head tilts in the opposite direction. Other postural reflexes that we have are the parachute reflex. So this has various levels to it, and the responses happen at different kind of age brackets. So in a upright position, if you lower the infant towards the ground, their legs will extend. So that's usually from 4 months to 12 months. If you tilt them sideways, you'll notice their arm extends. Tilt them forward or backward, arm extends. Sideways tilt, the arm will extend usually around 6 months. Tilt them forward, arms will extend around 7 months. Tilt them backwards, arms will extend around 9 months. Okay. These are developing, or these postural reactions are developing as a way to correct the distribution of the center of mass. So last week we kind of talked about how if the center of mass exits your base of support, that results in a fall. So if we develop strategies to stay stable, such as moving our arms to adjust the location of our center of mass, that's how they relate to riding reflexes, is to keep our center of mass within whatever the base of support that we have is. An example of the parachute reflex would look something like this, at least the earlier one. So if we have the infant held in an upright position and we lower or tilt their body suddenly, this is an example of no response. So that's a baby who's 3.5 weeks old. And then the same baby, they filmed at like 10 months-ish, right? But as they drop, you can see their legs and or arms extend. Okay. The other reflexes that we have in our categories of infantile reflexes are the locomotor reflexes. And we've got crawling. Starting position is in prone. The stimulus is if you apply pressure to the sole of the foot. A crawling pattern in the arms and legs will result. This is not to be confused with a crawling movement, though. Okay, it's a crawling reflex. So apply pressure to the bottom of the feet, and then the arms and legs will kind of kick in alternating ways. Swimming and stepping reflexes are appearing kind of at similar times, from birth to about 5 months. Stepping is one of the reflexes that I'll have you guys be able to visually identify. But if the infant is held upright and you place them on a flat surface, you'll notice a walking pattern appears in the legs. Again, this isn't an intentional pattern, but it is a reflex. Okay. Swimming reflex, the starting position is prone. The stimulus is if you hold an infant horizontally. The response is that they start swimming movement with their arms and legs. I really wanted to put a gif of like a dog, like when you hold them over water, they start doggy paddling. While it wouldn't be identical in an infant, I'd imagine it's kind of similar. Okay. But you can see all of these reflexes result in similar movement patterns that we would observe in locomotion. So locomotor reflexes are precursors to moving around, which usually you'll have babies start to crawl and creep after 4 or 5 months. So this is an example of the stepping reflex. Again, starting position needs to be held upright, and if you hold them on a flat surface, you'll notice that a stepping motion occurs, right? So the stimulus is on this foot, and then it lifts up. Typically, developing infants will show less specific stimulus-response bonds with time until you can eventually no longer observe the reflex. So we've kind of hinted at this in the timelines of when reflexes will appear or disappear. Primitive reflexes in particular can weaken or become modified after 2 weeks once the infant starts to make associations with that particular reflexive response. So like a sucking response, they might start to associate like sucking faster with more milk, right? So in feeding times if they're hungry, but then that reflex ends up disappearing because they've made an association now with a voluntary control of that movement or action. Primitive reflexes can also be weakened or modified due to exposure to environmental constraints. So if the infant's not in the correct position, when you apply whatever stimulus belongs to that reflex that you're assessing, if they're not in the correct position, then that doesn't elicit the correct response. So body positioning or different things that are interacting with the infant in the environment to create the stimulus could also be affecting whether you see or don't see certain reflexes. The pattern of appearance and disappearance can be useful in detecting atypical development, as I hinted to in our previous lecture video. Warning signs may include absence, persistence, or asymmetry in responses. So asymmetry in the sense that one side of the body is not responding in the same way or strength as the other side of the body. This could be both in symmetrical reflexes, where both sides of the body are performing the same response, or where you could observe like the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, like turn the head to the right, arm and leg extend, maybe they turn the head to the left, and the left side doesn't respond. So both sides of the body could be moving, or just one side, and then you're comparing sides. But in any of these cases, atypical development could be the result of a central nervous system condition and or other pathologies. We also might use the reappearance of reflexes in assessment of traumatic head or spinal cord injuries. So the Babinski reflex is often used as an assessment after head injury to see if any significant damage has occurred to the brain. If infantile reflexes are going to eventually disappear for the most part, you might be questioning what the purpose of them is. We kind of talked about primitive reflexes being or functioning for survival. So some of the reflexes you might have been like, oh yeah, like that makes sense, right? Or having the asymmetric tonic neck reflex preventing a baby from rolling over so that they don't suffocate if they, turn over and they don't have enough strength to push their bodies up. Researchers have kind of condensed how they might explain the roles of reflexes in 3 general ways. So the structural explanation views reflexes as a byproduct of the neurological system. In other words, reflexes reflect the structure or the hardwiring of the nervous system, so that's kind of more aligned with like the maturational perspective, that you have the appearance and disappearance of reflexes as the nervous system develops. The functional explanation suggests that reflexes aid in infant survival, so they provide a function. An example of a function of like prenatal reflexes could be to position a fetus for delivery, for example. They also function for sensory consequences, right? You start to create these stimulus-response bonds, and eventually, once you are able to create those associations, you voluntarily can start adjusting how you react or interact with your environment. Both the structural and functional views primarily consider reflexes at birth, but they don't really suggest any further purpose after birth, which is where applied kind of theories come in. So those try to explain the purpose of reflexes as playing a role in future volitional movements. In other words, reflexes are going to afford infants the ability to practice certain movements involuntarily before the coordination patterns occur voluntarily. All right, that kind of concludes our lecture on reflexes and spontaneous movements in early infancy. Our next lecture videos are going to be covering motor milestones.